going to do this question about Kim. This question was from the 2009 AP exam. So my personal analysis is that the question wording is a little outdated, meaning that I think that the College Board has gotten better at asking these questions, and therefore students, I think, are a little bit more able to perceive what is expected of them. But I think that this question is still really worth us doing. So because the skills that are in it are things that you're going to be asked to do. So here we have a question. It says, assume that the reserve requirement is 20% and that banks hold no excess reserves. Assume that Kim deposits $100 of cash from her pocket into her checking account. Calculate each of the following. So when you see the words calculate each of the following, that tells us that all three of these are going to have some sort of dollar amount attached to them, okay? So just like you would in the AP exam, we're going to put our questions on a separate piece of paper and label them carefully. So for this question, we're going to do part A, and we've got 1, 2, and 3. So from that $100, what is the maximum dollar amount the commercial bank can initially lend? So right from the start, we're going to think about how much of that $100 needs to be kept in the required reserves versus the excess. Because remember, lending must only come from the excess. So if the reserve requirement is 20%, that means that $20 are going to be in the required reserves, and that leaves $80 left over that the bank can initially lend. The maximum total change in demand deposits in the banking system. So I'm going to use a scrap piece of paper to sort of explain some of this stuff, and then I'm going to come back to my answer sheet. So remember that the bank can loan out $80 of her cash. When they loan out that $80 will be spent. It will then come back into a bank, and that bank, wherever that bank is, will then be able to loan out 80% of that money because, again, the reserve requirement is 20%. So when that $80 comes back into a bank, 20% of it is going to go into the required reserves, which means that there is going to be $64 available for lending. From that $64, that money is going to get spent. It is going to get redeposited into a bank. $12.80 is going to be left in a bank's vault, and therefore this bank is going to have money to loan out. Let me have your permission to round because I don't really want to subtract $12.80 from 64, but let me just do 13. So that means this bank is going to have around $51 to loan out. That money is going to get spent. It's going to get redeposited into a bank. A bank is going to have to keep 20% of it. Again, can we round, please? So that's going to be about $10 in the required reserves. That's going to give that bank $41 of which it can loan out. Do you see where we're going with this? Okay. So rather than continuing to do this until we can't do this anymore, we know that there's a more efficient way to add up all these different deposits, and that is called the money multiplier. So for this part of the question, you need the money multiplier and you need your knowledge of what the phrase demand deposits needs. So demand deposits are all those checking accounts, right? It's savings accounts, it's mutual money market accounts, it's all those different types of savings options that people have in banks. So remember, the money multiplier is this whole theory that when money gets loaned out, it gets spent again and redeposited, and then the bank has to keep the required and they loan out the excess. It gets redeposited, they keep the required, they loan out the excess, and so on and so forth. So every time the money gets redeposited, that's technically a demand deposit, and I'm just going to write DD next to it. So luckily, we have a formula that can expedite the process of this. And instead of adding all of these things up, we can just take this $80 and we can multiply it by the money multiplier. So the money multiplier is 1 over the reserve requirement. In this case, it's 1 over 0.2. That's really the same as saying $80 times 5. 1 over 2/10 is the same as 10 over 2, in case you're forgetting how I did that. And 80 times 5 equals $400. Now, this is not the answer to the question yet. We have to do one more step. The question said the maximum total change in demand deposits. So remember, Kim deposited $100 into her checking account. So that's one demand deposit. That means that her demand deposit added to all of these other demand deposits that grow from her initial deposit because they're lent out, we add those together and we get a grand total of $500. So the answer to this part of the question is $500. Now, for my brain, I wish part 3 was asked first because we already figured that out when we did the money multiplier up here. Remember, there's 2 ways to do this. You can take the initial amount of money that the bank can loan, $80, and you can multiply it by the money multiplier, and you can get 400, and there you go. Or you can try the second method. You can take her entire deposit, which is $100, times 5, which equals 500, and you can subtract the $100 that was already in the money supply that she had in cash. And you still get the same end. So here we go. 3 points right here, and they were all dollar amounts, just like we predicted. Part B. Part B says assume that the Federal Reserve buys $5 million in government bonds on the open market. As a result of the open market purchase, calculate the maximum increase in the money supply in the banking system. Just like with a deposit, we're going to use the money multiplier. So the money multiplier is 5. And they're going to purchase $5 million worth of securities. So this is going to result in a $25 million growth in the banking system. And you might be sitting there and saying to yourself, hey, why didn't you take out the reserve requirement? We're supposed to take out 20% of this. The reason why is because when the Fed purchases bonds on the open market or from banks, and that's a key distinction, open market or banks, 100% of that money is going to be loaned out. They do not have to keep 20% in the vault. It is not subject to the reserve requirement. And that's actually pretty logical because if the bank had to keep 20%, the Federal Reserve is doing something counterintuitive to what their intention was. So their intention is to provide $5 million of liquid cash for banks to be able to loan that out. So it would be counterproductive if they were to say, oh, by the way, don't loan out $1 million of it, which is 20%. So what's the point of that bond purchase if you're going to limit how much they had? Okay, so the answer to B is $25 million. Make sure you've got your dollar sign and your million written there. Remember, I like that instead of zeros because we're not going to miss a zero and get it wrong. Given the increase in the money supply in Part B, what happens to real wages in the short run? Remember that nominal wages are the ones that are sticky in the short run. You do not have to graph this, but I'm going to graph it so we can actually answer the question. So if you think about it, whether you had a fully employed economy or not, it wouldn't change the answer to this question. So I'm just going to do a fully employed economy because that's efficient and fast. If the money supply is larger, then that means that aggregate demand is going to increase because it means that households and businesses have more money. So I'm going to shift the aggregate demand line to the right, and I'm going to notice that price level is going to go up and real GDP grew. So what happens to real wages in the short run? So if nominal wages are sticky, so for example, if I make $10 an hour, in the short run, I'm still making $10 an hour because my nominal wages are sticky. But now everything is more expensive. So my $10 an hour no longer feels like $10 an hour because the purchasing power has declined because everything's more expensive. So my $10 an hour might feel like $9.25 an hour, let's just say, okay? So you don't have to draw any of this that I just did here, but I wanted to do that so you could see how I'm getting to the answer. So for part C, the answer is going to be real wages decrease due to higher price level with sticky nominal wages. Therefore, purchasing power has declined. And now that I'm writing this, I feel like I should have written a more grammatically sound sentence. Real wages decreased due to higher price level with sticky nominal wages. This part of it, I feel like you could explain a little bit better. You could have said something like, because nominal wages are sticky in the short run, their real wages will decrease due to higher price levels. Maybe you could write that a little bit more grammatically sound. I'm sort of going off the top of my head at the moment. But anyways, that's question A about Kim. I hope you loved it. And come see me if you have more questions.